All right, it is about 11 o'clock Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome, everybody. Most of you know me, but for those that don't, this is Nick Cortina from Exago. Before we get into the thick of things here, I do just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay, can see the screen all right. Please just go ahead and post a Y or a yes or any other funny anecdote that you'd like into the questions pane. Just let me know that you can hear me, see the screen all right. Want to make sure that we got all that out of the way before we get going. Okay, perfect. And I'm seeing some positive confirmation, which is awesome. So once again, my name is Nick Cortina here with Exago, and we're going to talk about chart data layout types today. And so we're going to take a look at each basic layout type that we've got over the course of the lab, and we're going to discuss some of the various options and things that you want to keep in mind that go along with each of these various chart types. There's going to be some degree of mapping between layouts and some of the various data structures that you're going to have. So effectively from the report that you're building, what chart layout is going to be most appropriate based on the underlying data there. We'll note that there's going to be some charts that can be created with more than one layout type depending on the format that you end up using for the actual tabular report. And one thing to note is that as we start to talk about some of the things we're getting into on this lab, you might be thinking, well, hey, didn't I see that long time ago? And the answer is yes. This is actually a redo of an existing lab that we did, I think, near the inception of this series a couple years ago. But given that that lab was one of the first labs we conducted, and it's a little bit dated in terms of the UI and the things we actually showed in that content, we figured this would be a good way for us to sort of revamp that lab and show off some of the new designer layouts that we've actually got in Exago today. So with that in mind, let's get started. And we will talk about the first chart layout type, which is cell-based. Now, this is generally speaking the most niche of the three data layouts and is really used in very specific types of charting. Our cell-based charts use a collection of static data points on a given report. And the difference between static and dynamic data fields is where they come from and how many times that they're going to display. So is that a data field in a group footer that's going to repeat multiple times? And in that case, the data would be dynamic. Or is it, say, an aggregate in a report footer that's going to show one value each time we run the report? And that might be something like take the average over a data set. That average value would be a good example of a static data field. So for cell-based charts, we need appropriately static data values or data fields to map to the chart. And the chart that we're actually going to be building in this case, as an extension of that, is going to be single series. And so that mandates that to build a chart on the report, in this case, all of the data is going to come from a report header or footer. And that's going to ensure that we only have that single static metric to show on the actual chart. So at this point, I'm going to jump over to a local Exago instance. And let's actually run a cell-based chart so we can get a quick example of what that looks like. So here, you're going to see that we're showing the minimum, the maximum, and the average days to ship. And then the report output here is fairly straightforward. We're just showing those three single metrics on a column chart here. And this is pretty high level. So we've just got these three values, right? So again, the key thing to consider here is that this chart layout type, this cell-based, is going to be something we want to leverage when we've got this type of output, where you sort of have any number of these single distinct static values that we want to show in some graphical representation. So output's pretty simple. Let's take a look at the actual designer here. So we can see the report design is, again, pretty simple. And we've got all of the actual data is coming from this report footer section. You'll notice that the only thing that's not actually data driven, aside from some of the labels that we've set up, are the actual label for the entire report up here in the page header. So for a cell-based chart, if I go and take a look at the actual chart designer here, I'm going to double click on that to open the chart wizard. We'll notice that we can pick any chart type that's going to support single series. So in this case, I've picked column. But something to note is that things like a stacked column or a stacked bar are not going to necessarily be appropriate for cell-based. Those chart types are going to rely on multiple series that we want to feed into the chart. So again, in this case, we want to pick something that's going to coordinate with single series. So if I navigate over to the data pane, you'll see here for our data layout, we've actually got cell-based selected. And one thing to note is that we've got to actually specify each of those individual point values. So you'll notice the ag average, the ag min, and the ag max actual formulas for each of the single point values. But something else you'll note is that these point labels aren't something that we actually statically input. They do have to come from the report designer somewhere. And so you'll notice that in this case, we've actually just gone and selected the specific labels that we want to leverage. One other thing that I would note here is that on the underlying report, instead of using these full labels, which show up nicely on the output, I'm just going to jump back to that for a second. In the context of the chart, all of this information might make it look a little bit cluttered on the x-axis labels. So what we've chosen to do instead is just include some sort of pared down versions of those labels to use as the chart x-axis labels. The other thing we've done here is I've suppressed this row, and that ensures that this content isn't going to display on the actual report output. Flipping backward again, we're going to see that's not showing anywhere here on the tabular side of things at least, but it is something that we can then still leverage for the chart point labels as we can see down below here. And just to sort of tie that off, I'm going to jump back into the chart wizard. Again, just double clicking on the chart and navigating back over to data, we'll see where those point labels have been selected. Now, this is really nice in terms of having that set of static values that you want to show in a single chart. But something kind of that we can kind of think about here is that these single series charts with these static values can be a little bit limited in scope. As I mentioned before, it's really for some of those more niche use cases, and it's not something that we're going to sort of heavily leverage for lots of different use cases, really more for some of those very specific fine-grained use cases that might come up. But there is another potential use case for the cell-based chart where maybe you've got that same collection or a similar collection of single values like this that perhaps you want to show for each of a grouped value. So maybe for each employee, we want to see what some of these metrics look like, and we still want those to be sort of separate charts. So maybe show one of these charts for each employee. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually just jump over to another report editor. So this is going to look fairly similar to what we were just looking at. And this is again just using a cell-based chart. But in this case, we're going to be including that in the group footer on the employee last name. And so now we're effectively going to show this chart once for each employee, for each unique value of employee last name, I should say. And we're going to generate each of these metrics for each employee and display them, and then create the chart based off those generated values for that instance of the employee last name. So in this case, just taking a quick look at the chart wizard here, we'll see I've still got the column type selected. If I go to my data layout, the cell-based chart is still selected here. None of the other content here is actually any different. But when we actually go and run this report, we'll see now we've got 9 pages of data. And now for each employee, we're going to see those individual metrics and sort of the tabular representation, and see that chart generated down below with the metrics being pulled directly from the chart. And as I go page by page here, you'll notice that we can see this being generated for each employee. The final piece of the puzzle, if you will, for modifying the previous report design to get to this one is the page break that's been included on the top row of the employee last name footer. And that's why we're guaranteeing that we only show one employee bit of information per page on the actual output here. So I want to pause there for just a minute, just take a look at questions, make sure we're all good there. All right, and it looks like we're doing okay on questions, which is great. So moving on, if you think about what we just generated in terms of the actual report output here, while it's nice that we can show these metrics on an employee by employee basis and have separate charts, it might also be nice for us to do something similar to this where perhaps all of the employee information is included on the same chart. So in that case, that'll kind of segue us nicely back to our next chart type, which is the column-based chart. So a column-based chart is used to show two or more aggregate metrics for each x-axis value, and those values will come from a column of data. Since we have two aggregate values per x-axis value, you can remember to use the column-based charting by asking yourself if your data points have an x and y per z relationship. Or another way to say that might be if the series values that you're showing are not related to one another. So there's going to be no nested grouping for this chart. And with a column-based chart, we'll also have the option to specify more than one aggregate metric. So in a multi-series column-based chart, we'll necessarily have two or more aggregate metrics as these are our series. So for this example, I'm going to jump back over to Exago. And we're going to use the same data that we looked at for the cell-based chart, but we're going to use it just a little bit differently. So I'm going to run the column-based chart first so we can see what that looks like. So now we've got a simple table up above, which is again showing that same set of metrics that we were generating previously. But now, instead of showing one chart for each employee, we've got a single chart that shows all of the employee information summed up together. And the nice thing here is we also have the ability to use some of our interactive series selectors. So if for whatever reason we wanted to go down and just compare one of the individual metrics, we could use the selectors to do that. So I want to jump into the designer for this report. And you'll note that we've got that same set of calculations. These formulas should look identical to what we saw in some of the other reports previously. But we'll note that these are all going to be included in the employee last name footer. And this footer is going to break once for each employee. So these metrics will be generated again once for each employee. But then beyond that, the chart is actually included in the footer in this case. So whereas in the cell-based with grouping example, we saw the chart in the employee group footer, now the chart is being displayed in the report footer, which will allow it to iterate over all of the individual employees and their respective calculations and show all of that information in the same chart. So jumping down to the report wizard, if I double click on this, the chart, that'll again open our chart wizard. And so in the data pane here, looking at the data layout, we'll see that this is now set to column-based. We'll see that for the x-axis labels, I've got the full name being displayed. And that comes again from the group footer on the employee last name. We'll see that our series values are also going to come from that footer on the employee last name as well. And so sort of similar to what we saw with the cell-based chart, we'll have to select each of the series that we want to display. The other thing we have the ability here to do is actually specify those series names. And in this case, we can actually key the series name directly into the editor here. We don't need it to exist on the report previously. One other thing I'd like to note here is that the series names and the actual series values should really come from the same grouping for this type of chart. So in this case, you'll note that the full name and all of the associated calculations all come from that same group footer on the employee's last name. So I'm just going to jump back to the output here. That's going to be our column-based chart types. I want to pause there again, just see if there's any other questions. One thing I would note just while we're taking a look at the questions pane is that from a general perspective, this is one of the chart types that we see most heavily used by our client base. All right, so it looks like we're doing okay on questions. I want to jump back to the PowerPoint here just to introduce the last of our chart types, which is going to be the row-based chart type. Now, these are actually pretty similar to the column-based charts because they also show dynamic data as opposed to static data with the cell-based charts. But they do differ from the column-based in the way that the data elements relate to each other. So in a row-based chart, we're going to have a nested grouping structure, which gives us an X per Y per Z relationship between the data values, the series labels, and the data labels or the X-axis labels. So we only have one aggregate metric, as the series value in this case will be served by a column of data. That means that we won't be able to create the same example that we've been working with so far using the row-based layout. So we're going to change the intention of the chart around a little bit just to meet some of the structural options that we have. So I'll jump back over to Exago. And again, I'm going to start with the output of the row-based chart here for us to look at. So in this case, we're going to see employees on the x-axis of the chart here, which is fairly similar to what we've been looking at so far. But now for each employee's aggregate metric, of which there's actually only one, it's going to be broken up by a secondary column of data. And that's going to be the series values that we can see here. So in this case, that's going to be the category name. So here, we've used the stacked bar chart because it's a really easy way to visually represent this row-based concept. So we can see that for these average days to ship, the averages are actually segmented out by the categories for each bar. Now, one thing to note, there's obviously many different chart types that are supported for the row-based chart types, as with the other chart types as well. But something to keep in mind is if we were to switch this to something like a column chart similar to what we were using before, while obviously the chart's still going to render, you can see that this probably looks a little bit more cluttered than the view that we just had previously with the stacked bar. So something to keep in mind as we're building these reports, and once you get to the point where you've determined which chart type is most appropriate given your data structure, another question that's good to ask yourself is, which visual representation of this data will best serve itself to actually convey some information to whoever is viewing or executing this report? And so that's something to keep in mind. Again, in this case, showing all the columns, maybe not the best way to represent this data. It's worth knowing that it's possible, but for our use case, the stacked bar is going to be a little bit more appropriate. Moving forward, again, we're going to see some other similar information in the tabular output down below. But one thing that we're going to notice is while we've got this category value that's showing for each employee, you'll also notice that the employee is going to be shown here multiple times as well. Now, part of this is due to the actual grouping that we've set up on this report. So I'm going to jump into the designer for a moment. And you'll see here that the grouping is actually on the category name. And so in this case, while the category names are going to be the series values that are displayed here, and the average days to ship is the actual aggregate metric that constitutes each bar, the full name is what's actually going to be showed on the x-axis. And so you might be thinking, well, why is this all in the footer on the category name? That answer is actually going to be something that we'll have to look at the sorts to discern. So in this case, we have the last name as the highest level sort on this report. And then within last name, we have category name. And so what that means is in terms of how the information is ordered and in turn, how it can be aggregated, we can have our highest levels of aggregation be at the employee last name because it's the highest level grouping on this report. Within each last name, so for each employee, we can then aggregate for each category name. And the reason we can do it in that manner is because the category name sort comes below the last name sort. So if we create a grouping on category name, that'll break for each unique category name within each unique employee. So if there were 10 categories and 5 employees, we would have 50 group footers for category name because last name would break 5 times, once for each employee. And then with each of those employee groupings, we would again break 10 times, once for each category name. So again, in this case, because category name comes under the last name, and we have the group footer on category name and not the employee last name, this full name will display once for each of the combinations of employee and category grouping. And that's why we see the employee name repeated for each category that we see that's displayed. Now, the nice thing is, again, jumping back to this report editor, if I go into the report header, in this case, we're showing the chart content in the header instead of in the footer. So if I jump in here, I'll jump over to the data pane. We'll note that on the type, I've selected a chart type that's going to support multiple series. And so on the data layout, we'll see that row-based chart is selected. And in this case, we've selected the data values. And again, you'll note that all of these values are coming from the same section on the report. You'll note that the actual aggregate that we're showing, the average, is going to come from the category name footer, and that's the data values. The data labels constitute the x-axis in this case. So in this use case, we're setting that to be the employee last name. And then finally, for the series labels, we've got the category name. And so something that's really nice here is that even though those employee last names showed multiple times and repeat for the number of categories that they're associated with, by setting the data labels to last name here, we saw on the actual chart itself that the chart was intelligent enough to not double up on any of the employee names, and it rolls all of those into one by virtue of the chart logic that we just established. So at this point, I'm going to pause again and just see if there's any other questions. All right, and we're looking okay on questions. So that's actually going to come to the end of the prepared content that I have for today's lab. I do just want to note that there are a couple other exciting labs that we've got coming up. I've got those up on the screen for you here. The next notable one will be on March 31st, and we're going to be talking about some of our dashboard SQL changes. That's definitely something we'll be really excited to talk about, so be sure to tune in for that. We're going to hang out for just a couple minutes in case there's any other lingering questions. But that said, if you are all set and you decide to leave, have a great day and happy reporting.